The Sodder Children Mystery, USA, 1945. On Christmas Eve, 1945, a fire tore through the Sodder family's home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. When the flames were finally out, 5 of the 10 children were missing, yet no trace of their bodies was ever found. Some believe the children died in the blaze, but others whispered of kidnappings, conspiracies, and cover-ups. This is one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries, the story of the Sodder Children. You're watching Hey Spooky. Let's dive into the darkness. Chapter 1: A Family in West Virginia. In the heart of Fayetteville, West Virginia, in the 1940s, nestled against the Appalachian Mountains, stood a modest 2-story house that belonged to George and Jennie Sodder. To the people of town, the Sodders looked like the picture of an immigrant success story. George had come to the United States from Italy as a teenager, carrying little more than determination and a willingness to work hard. By the mid-1940s, he had built a solid life. He owned a trucking business that delivered coal and goods across the region, and he had a large family with Jennie, a woman equally strong-willed and devoted. Together, George and Jennie raised 10 children. 10 lives filled the home with laughter, noise, and energy, creating a house that was rarely quiet. Their names were as ordinary as the times: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Jr., Betty, Sylvia, John, George Jr., Marion, and Joseph, whom everyone called Joe. Their home became a lively place, one that symbolized the American dream many immigrants longed for. But under that surface, shadows were quietly gathering, waiting for the right moment to descend. George, by all accounts, was not a man who blended in quietly. He had strong political opinions, especially about his native country's dictator, Benito Mussolini. He openly criticized Mussolini, calling him a tyrant and a murderer. This might not seem unusual, considering America had just fought a world war against fascism, but Fayetteville's Italian immigrant community wasn't unified in its views. Some admired Mussolini, or at least didn't tolerate criticism of him. George's fiery words earned him enemies. People warned him to keep quiet, but George refused. He believed in speaking his mind, no matter the consequences. Life in the Sodder household revolved around family, faith, and work. George worked long hours with his trucking company, while Jennie managed the household and cared for the children. The older children helped where they could, watching their younger siblings or running errands into town. Christmas was always special in the Sodder home. Even though they weren't wealthy, George and Jennie ensured that their children never went without gifts, food, or warmth during the holidays. By 1945, as the world celebrated the end of World War II, there was an extra sense of relief and hope in the Sodder home. For the first time in years, the future seemed brighter. But the Sodders' good fortune did not shield them from strange and unsettling encounters in the months leading up to the fateful night. A stranger once appeared at the family home, asking about work. Standing in the yard, he looked up at the house and remarked ominously, "This house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." George brushed it off as nonsense, but the words hung heavy in the back of his mind. On another occasion, a man tried to sell George life insurance. When George refused, the salesman grew angry, warning him that his house would burn and his children would pay for his stubbornness. The Sodder children themselves had no idea how dark things might become. They lived the way children always have, with joy and innocence. The older siblings went to school, worked part-time jobs, or helped their father. The younger ones played outside, invented games, and dreamed of Christmas morning. To neighbors, they seemed like any other family, not one destined for tragedy. The house itself was simple, but warm and filled with life. It had a staircase leading up to the second floor where the children's bedrooms were located, and a large living area downstairs where the family often gathered. A ladder rested against the outside wall, used for roof repairs or to help in emergencies. 2 coal trucks sat in the yard, ready for George's deliveries. The Sodders may not have been rich, but they were resourceful. Their home was a fortress of love and routine, one that seemed unshakable. Yet Fayetteville was not as peaceful as it looked. For all its small-town charm, rumors, secrets, and resentments ran through its streets like underground rivers. George's loud opposition to Mussolini didn't go unnoticed. Enemies had quietly marked him, though he may not have realized how far some would go. The Sodder family's prominence in town, Their large home, their thriving business, their outspoken father made them stand out. And in a place where not everyone welcomed outsiders, that was dangerous. Christmas Eve of 1945 was approaching. Snow dusted the mountains, and the town prepared for celebration. In the Sodder home, excitement built as Jennie and the children decorated, cooked, and wrapped presents. George looked on with pride, grateful for the family he had built and the success he had carved from nothing. The children's laughter echoed through the rooms, mixing with the smell of pine and fresh-baked sweets. But beneath the holiday cheer, a storm was gathering, one made of resentment, warnings ignored, and enemies George didn't know he had. Within days, their home would be reduced to ashes, and the Sodders' name would be tied forever to one of America's strangest and most haunting mysteries. Chapter 2: Strange Warnings and Threats. In small towns, secrets rarely stay hidden for long. Yet in Fayetteville, whispers and warnings often traveled faster than truth. For the Sodder family, those whispers had begun months before Christmas 1945. George Sodder was no stranger to conflict. His sharp tongue and strong opinions about politics had already made him stand out. But what began as simple disagreements soon took a darker turn, with threats that would later feel like eerie prophecies. It started innocently enough, or so George thought. A man approached him at home one day, claiming to be looking for work. As the two men stood outside, the stranger looked up at the Sodder house, his gaze lingering on the walls and windows as though studying them. Then he said something that George never forgot. "This place is going to go up in smoke. And when it does, your children are going to be destroyed." The words were chilling. For a moment, George froze, unsure if the man was serious or simply trying to intimidate him. But the stranger left as quickly as he had come, never asking for work again. George tried to shake it off, telling himself that people said strange things all the time. He didn't want to alarm Jennie or the children, so he kept it mostly to himself. But the threats didn't stop there. Weeks later, another man appeared, this one selling life insurance. George, who was practical but stubborn, declined the offer. He didn't like being pressured into things he didn't want, and he told the salesman no in no uncertain terms. That refusal sparked an angry outburst. The salesman, his voice sharp and bitter, lashed out with words that would later echo like a curse. "Your house is going to burn, and your children will pay for your stubbornness." This wasn't just sales talk. This was personal, venomous, and filled with intent. Jennie, overhearing parts of the exchange, later admitted she felt uneasy about it. The Sodders weren't superstitious, but when threats keep circling back to fire, to destruction, and to their children, even the most logical mind begins to wonder. Around the same time, George noticed other unsettling signs. A man parked by the road seemed to be watching the children as they walked home from school. On more than one occasion, Marion, one of the older daughters, reported seeing strangers loitering near the property. They never said much, but their presence was enough to make George uneasy. He began to suspect that his outspoken criticism of Mussolini had stirred up resentment in the local Italian community, resentment that might now be targeting his family. Still, George was not the type to live in fear. He dismissed some of it as paranoia. His trucking business kept him busy, and the children's lives were filled with school, chores, and play. Jennie often tried to reassure him, reminding him that people talk, people threaten, but not all words lead to action. Yet deep down, even she admitted that something about these encounters felt different. The Sodders also began noticing small, strange occurrences around their home. George found his ladder, usually propped against the side of the house for roof repairs, moved or misplaced. He also discovered that two of his coal trucks, which had been working perfectly, suddenly refused to start despite having no obvious mechanical issues. At the time, these seemed like inconveniences, but later, they would feel like deliberate sabotage. As Christmas approached, the warnings seemed to fade into the background. Fayetteville, like many American towns in December 1945, buzzed with anticipation of the holiday season. World War II had ended, and families were eager to return to normal life. Stores decorated their windows, church bells rang, and snow fell softly on the mountain roads. For the Sodders, preparing for Christmas meant decorating the house, baking sweets, and wrapping presents for the younger children. Inside their home, laughter replaced fear, at least for the children. The older siblings, Marion and John, took on extra responsibilities, while the younger ones, Martha, Louis, Jennie Jr., and Betty, buzzed with excitement about what Santa might bring. Even little Sylvia, the baby of the family, felt the energy in the air. George, however, remained unsettled. He was a man who trusted hard work and determination, not omens, but something in his gut told him that the threats were not empty. He kept replaying those words, "Your house is going to burn. Your children will be destroyed." He wanted to protect his family, but how do you defend against shadows? Against enemies you can't see? Jennie tried to push the fear aside by focusing on traditions. She baked cookies, hung decorations, and wrapped small gifts, determined that her children would have a magical holiday. She wanted them to feel safe and loved, even if she too had begun to sense the weight of those warnings. To the outside world, the Sodders were simply preparing for Christmas. But inside the walls of that house, unease lingered. It was subtle, hidden under carols and candlelight, but it was there, an invisible tension waiting for its breaking point. And on Christmas Eve, when the family gathered one last time under their decorated tree, no one could have predicted how quickly the warnings would become reality. Within hours, the Sodder home would collapse into fire and ash, and 5 of their children would vanish into a mystery that still haunts America to this day. Chapter 3: The Night of the Fire. Christmas Eve of 1945 should have been nothing more than a night of joy for the Sodder family. Their home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, glowed with warmth and celebration. The Christmas tree sparkled with lights and tinsel, filling the room with a soft glow that reflected in the eager eyes of the children. Laughter echoed through the house as the younger ones tore open candy boxes, while the older siblings tried to keep the chaos under control. Jennie Sodder, always the heart of the home, moved between the kitchen and the living room, making sure everyone had enough to eat. George, though tired from work, allowed himself to relax, enjoying the sight of his family gathered together. Outside, a thin blanket of snow covered the ground, muffling the world in silence. It was, in every way, a perfect Christmas Eve until it wasn't. Around 10:30 p.m., Jennie began ushering the children to bed. Marion, the eldest daughter, had surprised her younger siblings with toys from her job at the dime store, and excitement made it difficult to settle them down. George, practical as ever, reminded the children not to stay up too late. But 5 of them, Betty, 5, Jennie Jr., 8, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, and Maurice, 14, begged to stay awake longer to play with their new gifts. Jennie relented, allowing them a few extra hours, while she, George, little Sylvia, and 2 of the older boys went to bed. By midnight, the house had grown quiet. Jennie drifted off to sleep, comforted by the soft sound of the children's voices still playing downstairs. But around 12:30 a.m., she was startled awake by the sharp ring of the telephone. She climbed out of bed, annoyed but curious, and answered. On the other end was a woman's voice, one Jennie didn't recognize. The caller asked for someone Jennie didn't know. When Jennie politely explained she had the wrong number, the woman laughed oddly, then hung up. Jennie thought it was strange, but she shrugged it off and went back toward bed. As she passed the living room, she noticed the lights were still on and the curtains open. She assumed the children had forgotten, and she turned them off herself before heading upstairs. But just as she began to settle again, a loud bang jolted her. It was followed by what sounded like something rolling onto the roof, then sliding off. The sound disturbed her, but when nothing else happened, she convinced herself it was just the wind or snow shifting. At 1 a.m., Jennie woke again, this time to the smell of smoke. Panic surged through her body. She rushed out of bed and discovered flames near George's office, where he kept his coal trucks and equipment. The fire spread with terrifying speed, devouring walls and racing upward toward the second floor where the children slept. George and Jennie screamed for their children to wake. Marion, John, and George Jr. managed to escape, as did Jennie and baby Sylvia. But the 5 younger ones, Betty, Jennie Jr., Martha, Louis, and Maurice, remained trapped upstairs. George tried everything. He sprinted outside to grab his ladder, planning to reach the second floor windows, but the ladder, which he always kept leaning against the house, was missing. Frantic, he ran to his trucks, thinking he could drive one close to the house and climb onto the roof. But both trucks, which had been working perfectly the day before, refused to start. Inside, Jennie screamed for her children. Marion and the older boys threw water from buckets, but the fire was too strong. In less than 45 minutes, the Sodder home collapsed into smoldering rubble. Neighbors began to gather, watching in shock as the house was consumed. Someone ran to call the fire department, but communication in rural Fayetteville was slow. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, didn't even answer the phone at first. Eventually, he relied on a phone tree system, where each firefighter had to call another to alert his crew. It was nearly morning before the firemen finally arrived, long after the house had burned to ash. By then, George and Jennie were inconsolable. Their 5 children were gone, presumed dead in the fire. But almost immediately, questions began to surface. Where were the remains? Firefighters sifted through the rubble but found no bones, no skull fragments, nothing to suggest that 5 young bodies had been consumed. The official explanation was that the blaze had been hot enough to completely incinerate the children. But George, Jennie, and many experts who later studied the case knew that was nearly impossible. Adding to the mystery, the missing ladder was discovered tossed down an embankment, far from where George had left it. A telephone repairman reported that the Sodders' phone line had been cut, not destroyed by the fire, and the trucks, both of them, seemed deliberately tampered with. George and Jennie began to believe the unthinkable, that their children had not perished in the fire at all, but had been taken. The blaze, they suspected, had been set intentionally, not to kill the children, but to cover up their abduction. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, the Sodders stood in the ruins of their home. Smoke curled up from the blackened remains, carrying with it the scent of ash and sorrow. The Christmas tree, once glowing with joy, was now nothing but charred wood. Neighbors tried to comfort them, but no words could reach through the devastation. What remained was not only grief, but also questions. Dark, gnawing questions that would never leave the Sodder family. What happened to Betty, Jennie Jr., Martha, Louis, and Maurice? Were they truly consumed by the fire, or had something far more sinister taken them into the night? Chapter 4. The Search for Answers. The morning after the fire, Fayetteville awoke to shocking news. The Sodder family home had burned to the ground, and 5 of the Sodder children were presumed dead. Yet as the smoke cleared and investigators sifted through the ashes, the truth became harder to accept. Where were the bodies? Fire Chief F.J. Morris, along with his small crew, combed through the debris. They expected at least fragments, bones, teeth, something. But they found nothing. No human remains. No evidence that 5 young lives had ended in that inferno. Morris, almost apologetically, told the grieving parents that perhaps the flames had been hot enough to completely reduce the children's bodies to ash. But Jennie Sodder, desperate yet sharp-minded, didn't believe it. She began researching. She spoke with crematorium workers, read about house fires, and asked experts for their opinions. Over and over, she heard the same answer. Even in cremations where temperatures reached over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, bones survived. Yet her house fire had only burned for about 45 minutes. It seemed impossible that 5 bodies would leave nothing behind. This single detail planted the seed of doubt, a doubt that grew stronger with each strange discovery. Strange clues. First, there was the missing ladder. George had always kept it propped against the house, ready in case of emergency. On the night of the fire, it was gone. Days later, it was found discarded in a ditch far from the home. Then there were the trucks. Both of George's coal trucks had been functioning perfectly the day before, but when he tried to start them during the fire, neither engine turned over. Later mechanics found nothing wrong. Someone, it seemed, had tampered with them. And the telephone line, cut clean, not burned. A repairman confirmed this. Someone had climbed the pole and sliced through the wire before the fire began, cutting off the Sodders' line to the outside world. The more the family examined these clues, the less the tragedy looked like an accident. To George and Jennie, it began to feel like something much darker, a deliberate crime. Rumors in town. The Sodders weren't just any family. George was an outspoken Italian immigrant, fiercely opinionated, especially about politics. He was vocal in his criticism of Mussolini and the fascist government in Italy, and his views made him enemies. Some in the Italian immigrant community resented him. Others outright threatened him. In the months before the fire, strange incidents added to Jennie's unease. A traveling salesman had come to the Sodder home, offering insurance. When George refused, the man allegedly warned him, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to pay for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." Not long after, another man appeared, seeking work. While walking around the house, he pointed to the fuse box and said it would someday cause a fire. George thought the comment odd, since the electrical system had recently been inspected and deemed safe. Neighbors also recalled seeing strangers parked along the road, watching the Sodder children. At the time, it seemed harmless. After the fire, it seemed chilling. The investigation. Despite these red flags, the official response was lackluster. Authorities quickly ruled the blaze an accident caused by faulty wiring. George and Jennie rejected this explanation. The Christmas lights had been glowing even after the fire started, meaning the wiring was intact. When the family pressed for a deeper investigation, they were met with resistance. Fire Chief Morris admitted, years later, that he had discovered something in the ashes, a heart. He claimed to have placed it in a box and buried it at the scene. When the box was later exhumed, the so-called heart turned out to be nothing more than beef liver, untouched by fire. Why Morris would fabricate such a bizarre story remains a mystery. The Sodders, unconvinced by the official story, began their own investigation. They placed ads in newspapers across the country, offering $5,000, later $10,000, for information about their missing children. Tips flooded in, some wild, others hauntingly plausible. One witness claimed to have seen the children peering out of a passing car as the fire raged. Another said they had been spotted at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston. Still others reported seeing the children in the company of strangers. One sighting described them at a hotel in South Carolina, guarded by adults who refused to let them speak. Each lead reignited the Sodders' hope. Each one also deepened the mystery. Jennie's obsession. For Jennie, the fire was not the end but the beginning of a lifelong search. She refused to accept that her children had died that night. Every day, she wore black as a sign of mourning, but her mourning was for their absence, not their death. She studied fire science, consulted investigators, and pored over every possible clue. Neighbors whispered that she had become obsessed. Maybe she had, but if so, it was an obsession born from a mother's refusal to surrender her children to the flames. At the family's request, the site of the fire was left untouched for years. Eventually, George bulldozed the remains and turned the ground into a memorial garden for his missing children. Yet even there, hope remained. Hope that they might still be alive somewhere out in the world. A haunting question. What really happened that night in 1945? Was it truly an accident? A tragic blaze that consumed everything in its path? Or was it something else, something darker, something that reached into the Sodders' home and stole away 5 young lives without a trace? For George and Jennie, there was only one answer. Their children did not die in that fire. And if they were alive, someone knew where they were. The fire had left behind only ashes, smoke, and silence. But it also left behind a mystery that would outlive both parents, a mystery that still burns with unanswered questions to this day. Chapter 5. The Theories and Strange Sightings. As the years stretched on after the fire, the Sodder family's search for answers only deepened the mystery. Every tip, every rumor, every strange encounter seemed to add another layer to a story that already felt impossible. The official explanation, an accidental fire, wasn't enough. Too many details refused to fit. Too many clues pointed elsewhere. And so, theories began to swirl. Some whispered in hushed tones. Others shouted in newspapers across the country. The mafia connection. One of the most enduring theories ties the Sodders' tragedy to organized crime. George Sodder was a proud Italian immigrant, but unlike many in Fayetteville's community, he despised Mussolini and wasn't afraid to say it out loud. He had made enemies. Some believed the fire was no accident at all, but a warning. Perhaps the children were taken as leverage, hidden away to punish George for his politics, or for refusing to bend to the demands of powerful men. The odd insurance salesman's threat about smoke and children destroyed suddenly seemed less like sales talk and more like a prophecy. If the mafia was involved, It might explain why authorities were quick to close the case, why evidence was ignored, and why leads were allowed to fade. After all, who would dare go against such powerful forces? Strange sightings. Then came the sightings, each one a spark of hope in the Sodders' endless night. A woman working at a Charleston motel claimed to have seen 4 of the Sodder children just weeks after the fire. She remembered them clearly, she said, because they looked frightened, and 2 men with Italian features kept a close watch over them. Another report came from a St. Louis woman who said she had overheard 2 strangers in a bar discussing a house fire in West Virginia. One had allegedly bragged that the children were taken, not killed. The most chilling came from Florida, where a woman insisted she had seen one of the Sodder girls at a convent. The child, she swore, looked exactly like Marion Sodder. When George traveled there to investigate, the nuns refused to let him see the girl. Were these genuine glimpses of the missing children, or desperate projections from grieving strangers who wanted to help? The Sodders chose to believe. The letter from Kentucky. Then, in 1967, more than 20 years after the fire, Jennie Sodder received a letter that reignited her hope. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s, dark-haired, with deep, piercing eyes. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Illo boys, a 90132 or 35. Louis had been one of the children lost in the fire, and the man in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to him, especially around the eyes. George and Jennie were convinced it was Louis. They hired a private investigator and sent him to Kentucky to track down the sender. The man never returned, and the Sodders never heard from him again. To this day, no one knows what happened to him, or why the trail went cold so abruptly. The photograph remained with Jennie for the rest of her life, framed and displayed on her mantle. She looked at it every day, convinced it was her son, grown but alive. Silence from the authorities. Despite the strange evidence, local officials refused to reopen the case. Some suggested the Sodders were clinging to false hope, unwilling to accept the harsh truth. Others dismissed the sightings and letters as hoaxes, designed to exploit a grieving family. But to George and Jennie, the silence spoke louder than any words. They felt abandoned, left to fight a battle against shadows alone. A mystery without end. By the late 1960s, George and Jennie were aging, but their obsession never faded. They built a billboard near their home with the children's faces and the words, "What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Still missing?" For decades, that sign stood as a haunting reminder to everyone driving through Fayetteville. Each theory, each sighting, each cryptic clue added to the puzzle, but the picture never came together. Were the Sodder children alive somewhere, hidden by people with power and motive? Or were these sightings nothing more than false trails, feeding hope that had nowhere to go? In the end, the Sodders had only their faith, their grief, and their refusal to give up. The world had moved on. They never did. Chapter 6: Legacy and Haunting Questions. The Sodder children never came home. The fire that Christmas Eve night left behind not just a broken family, but one of America's most enduring mysteries. For George and Jennie Sodder, hope never faded. They rebuilt their lives, but the wound never closed. The absence of 5 children was like a shadow that followed them everywhere. Every rumor, every letter, every strange sighting, no matter how unlikely, was another thread they felt compelled to chase. The billboard of grief. Perhaps the most haunting symbol of their obsession stood along Route 16, near their home in Fayetteville, a massive billboard with the faces of their missing children. Beneath their portraits, bold words demanded answers. What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Still missing? For decades, that sign loomed over the road, a constant reminder to anyone passing by that something terrible and unresolved had happened in this quiet corner of West Virginia. It was not only a memorial, but also an accusation, a public refusal to accept the official explanation. Travelers from across the country saw the billboard, and many would stop, asking about the case, sharing rumors, or simply staring at the faces of children frozen in time. The sign became as famous as the mystery itself, etched into the collective memory of anyone who saw it. A family changed forever. George spent the rest of his life searching for the truth. Each dead end chipped away at him, but he never stopped. When he died in 1969, he carried with him questions that had no answers. Jennie lived until 1989, always keeping the photograph of the man she believed was Lewis displayed in her home. She wore black every day, a symbol of mourning that lasted more than 40 years. Their surviving children, too, were marked by the mystery. Some continued the search after their parents' deaths, though with time the leads grew colder and the voices of those who might have known the truth fell silent forever. Why no closure came? Theories still swirl about organized crime, government cover-ups, mistaken identity, or even family secrets. But no evidence has ever been strong enough to close the case. The lack of remains, the strange phone calls, the suspicious threats, all remain as fragments, each one suggesting something larger but never revealing the whole picture. In truth, it may be that the answers were buried long ago, hidden by people who had the power to erase the truth and silence those who asked too many questions. Or perhaps the tragedy was exactly what the authorities claimed, a fire, cruel and final, that left nothing behind. The mystery lives on. Today, the Sodder case is remembered not just as a mystery, but as a story of relentless love and defiance. It is a reminder of how far parents will go for their children and how some questions linger long after the world has moved on. The Sodder children's faces, preserved in photographs and retold in stories, still haunt true crime circles and late-night discussions. The case has appeared in books, documentaries, and countless theories online, each one keeping the mystery alive. But in Fayetteville, among those who once drove past that lonely billboard, the story is not just a mystery. It is a wound carved into the town's history, one that time has never fully healed. Because somewhere in that December night of 1945, 5 children vanished into smoke and shadows. And whether they were taken by fire or by something far darker, the truth remains locked away beyond reach. The Sodders never stopped asking. Neither have we.